Welcome to Things You Don't Know. In this episode, we look at Dr. Charles Duncan, a man I was honored to know. Charles Duncan played essential roles in civil rights, education, political, and legal arenas. Despite his many accomplishments, he's barely known by most people. Some of his accomplishments were serving as a guest lecturer at Howard University, serving as dean of the Howard University Law School. He was a practicing attorney. He also helped prepare arguments heard before the Supreme Court of the United States, most notably, perhaps, the Brown versus Board of Education case. He also worked to resolve the conflict between Iran and the USA in 1994 and helped calm the riots in Washington, D.C. After sneaking out to witness Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, I was inspired to join the civil rights movement and heard of Charlie Duncan. Trust me, if my parents had known I snuck downtown to see Dr. King's speech, I'm sure I would have been grounded until I was an adult because it was possibly dangerous. But you know what? Like most kids, I thought I was invincible. Nothing could happen to me. And thankfully, they never found out about my adventure.
I envy you that experience, Dr. Weaver. It was a once in a lifetime event. Dr. Duncan played a significant role in the fight for racial equality before the law and in society. He advanced education excellence, as you said, helped resolve the conflict over the late Shah's assets between Iran and the United States in 1994, and moved between highly varied segments of society internationally and nationally with humor and grace. Too often, I've found as a historian, people looking back on great struggles lose the humanity of those who fight them. Dr. Charles Duncan was a man who refused to be treated as anything less than anybody, but never allowed his many accomplishments to lead to ego or an inflated sense of importance. The average person studying the movement for racial justice has learned of the heroic struggles of Dr. Booker T. Washington, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Muslim leader Malcolm X. The reality is the movement included thousands of ordinary men and women who made heroic efforts to bring about racial justice and break down the odious practice of segregation in both law and practice. These lesser known but vital leaders often used a combination of legal cases and moral persuasion. In this profile, we look at one of the most valuable lesser known leaders who, as we've said, engaged in a lifetime of efforts, both on his own and in mentoring and training the next level of leaders in law and politics. In an interview with Dr. Duncan, he commented on his perception of segregation. These are his words. Those of us, black kids, Negro kids, in those days, colored people, if you will, who grew up in the middle class were significantly protected by our parents. We were shielded from this. We had our own little clubs, and Jack and Jill, that's a youth fraternal order. You've heard of that. You only went downtown if you had to, and you couldn't eat. You couldn't get a hot dog at Woolworths. My mother used to tell me, well, let's wait until we get home because the hot dogs at home and the food we have at home are better than these they have down here. And I could never understand why you couldn't go to the bathroom. I can't tell you how many times I've gone like this, waiting to get into the bathroom at the 7th and Massachusetts Avenue Public Library, Northwest. This was an interview for a history of the circuit court.
Yeah. Okay. So Charles Duncan was born on Halloween, ooh, October 31st, 1924, in Washington, D.C. Now, he was born at home because in that day and age, most African Americans were born at home, and many whites people were too. Anyhow, his mother, Gladys Duncan, at that time she was Gladys Tigner, and her husband, Charles Tigner, were his parents. Charles was born an only child. Now, interesting, Gladys, his mother, she lived to be over 100 years old. Okay, that's amazing. Anyhow, Gladys was a school teacher, and Charles Tigner was a prominent physician. His biological father, Charles Tigner, died in 1934. And sometime after that, his mother married Todd Duncan, a musician, music teacher, and a highly regarded vocalist internationally. Todd Duncan was the first person to star as Porgy in Gershwin's iconic musical Porgy and Bess. And there are some really interesting stories about how Todd Duncan actually met with Gershwin, auditioned for the part. He went there to see Gershwin, and he did not know he was supposed to bring an accompanist, and so he goes in and he surprised Gershwin because Gershwin said, "Well, what are you going to sing?" And he said an aria from this opera. Well, Gershwin kind of looks at him and goes, "So where's your accompanist?" And he said, "Well, I didn't know I needed to have one, but you play, don't you?" And he did accompany him a little bit, and then finally he stopped and said, "Can you sing this a cappella?" Which means without accompaniment. And Todd said, "Sure," and did so. He was hired on the spot. Okay. So anyhow, he was the first African American male to sing in the New York City Opera and a whole raft of other things. His musical niche, as I have alluded to, was opera. He was classically trained and in very high demand as a performer and teacher. After Dr. Tigner died, and uh, Charles was adopted by Todd and took on the last name Duncan while maintaining Charles Tigner as his middle name. So he's actually Charles Tigner Duncan. Anyhow, Charlie, as he preferred to be called outside of formal situations, had a very unique background. His parents were very well educated and quite financially secure. I think it's fair to say he was somewhat privileged, especially for an African descended male growing up in the mid 50s. Both his biological and adopted fathers recognized his superior intelligence and informally educated him in their respective fields. Now, his mother, Gladys, being a teacher, was very focused on ensuring that Charlie received the best education possible and worked consistently to see that that happened.
I'm very impressed at the levels of education he was able to acquire. After starting his education in the DC public school system, Dr. Duncan attended Mount Hermon Preparatory School for Boys in the 10th grade. He also studied at a preparatory school in England in 1938, as his stepfather had a year-long musical commitment there. After graduation, Dr. Duncan went on to Dartmouth College, where he graduated cum laude in 1947. He served in the U.S. Naval Reserve from 1945 to 46 during his time at Dartmouth. He studied law at Harvard Law School, graduating in 1950, finishing law school in only 1 year. He was asked many years later how he'd accomplished this feat. He replied, "I decided not to rest for more than 4 hours a night for an entire year."
Yeah, he was a very driven and laser focused kind of guy. Okay, an interesting and perhaps formative incident occurred during Charlie's sophomore year at Dartmouth. He played on the varsity tennis team. He was one of the players. And one of the matches was to take place at William and Mary College in Virginia. Dartmouth forfeited the vital tennis match rather than adhere to William and Mary's policy of not playing against African American and other, quote, non white players. The entire tennis team put down their rackets and made it clear that this was a form of witness against what the coach called a moral injustice. Dr. Duncan said it taught him the value of creating relationships within the system and outside of it. Now, this is interesting because many people in that position would say, oh, this just showed me how prejudiced people are. Duncan, on the other hand, took the opposite kind of strategy, saying it taught him the value of creating relationships within and outside of the system, which I think is quite remarkable.
Yes, I think that's something we need to remember. Don't let temporary injustice cause you to either back down or be filled with bitterness and resentment, but try to find a way to work within the moral structures of society to change things. The history makers, the most prominent African American video collection in the United States, spends a great deal of time looking at the next step of Dr. Duncan's long career. This was his work on the District of Columbia portion of the Brown versus Board of Education case, which made school separation on racial grounds illegal. This case began in early 1952, was argued before the Supreme Court twice, and lasted 2 years. Future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, then the head of the NAACP Defense Fund, had recruited an army of some of the finest legal and educational minds on earth to do their part to bring about a new and more just democratic society. The Delaware case was under the wise guidance and hands of Dr. James Nabrett, an associate of Dr. Duncan and the future president of Howard University. Justice Marshall and Dr. Nabrett had both been proteges of Charles Hamilton Houston, the World War I African-American captain who had made Howard University what he called the Black Harvard. Dr. Nabrett had found Dr. Duncan through the recommendation of famous psychologist Dr. Kenneth Clark. Their argument for integration was honed and shaped over 2 years' worth of long hours. The argument needed to mix hard legal facts with a broad humanitarian concept. Along with everything else, it was necessary during the Cold War era for the United States not to appear hypocritical about its democratic ideals to a rapidly decolonizing world. The lawyers would role play both sides of the argument to sharpen their upcoming court appearance. During a particularly stressful training session, Dr. Duncan calmed everyone by recalling an event from his youth. The details are recounted in Juan Williams' biography of Justice Marshall entitled American Revolutionary. Jim Nabrett was playing the role of former presidential candidate John W. Davis, Marshall's opponent and a leading proponent of the separate but equal idea. Nabrett acting as Davis would have, asked Justice Marshall, how do you justify forcing integration with all the social tensions that would create? Thurgood Marshall responded, we can no longer claim that American democracy rests on a legalized caste system. If there are problems about getting people to obey the law, let the Supreme Court worry about community attitudes. The argument went on for many hours and tempers flared. Charlie Duncan, to calm everyone, began singing his father's most well-known song from Porgy and Bess, There's a Boat Leaving Soon for New York. I think that's typical of the man, that he could give his all to something in total seriousness, but he never lost his sense of humor or desire to keep things on an even keel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Oh, except for one thing. I don't think that there's a boat leaving soon for New York. It was his most well-known song. I know some people say it is, but I think Old Man River.
You're probably correct about that.
That is such an iconic song. God, it's great. And especially if you ever hear a recording of him doing it, it was stunning, stunning. Anyhow, integrating a major DC landmark was the next task on Duncan's list here. The District of Columbia, being a federal territory, had begun integrating after the school decision. Maryland suburbs were slower to follow suit, as were Virginia suburbs. In the book's Summer of Change, it explains the District of Columbia began integrating, starting with the school system in 1953. Suburban communities in Maryland and Virginia did not follow suit. By 1958, Montgomery County of Maryland public schools were forced to bus African American students to integrated DC pools. Those of you who don't know, DC can get rather humid and hot in the summer. So, having a place to swim was kind of important to many people. Anyhow, while white students continued to take advantage of places like Glen Echo Amusement Park's Crystal Pool, a group of concerned residents concentrated in the local community of Bannockburn began to lobby for county-wide accommodation laws and protested the use of public funds for programs at the segregated, privately owned Glen Echo Amusement Park. Got to know, I grew up in that area, so I know a lot about this, but it was a total fun thing to ride. There was a trolley that went from downtown DC out to Glen Echo, which was on a little lake thing. And the ride getting there was almost as much fun as being there in many, many cases. Anyhow, in the spring of 1960, a group of students, many of them from Howard University, organized themselves into the Nonviolent Action Group, or NAG, NAG, and began protesting Northern Virginia lunch counters, restaurants, and department stores. And yeah, I do remember that, which was, it was a little confusing to me as a child why that was going on. All right. And I did go and talk to some of them as they were, picketing or whatever. And, at first they would always be, what are you doing? What do you want? Get away from us. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I thought what you were talking about was not getting away from each other, but getting to know each other better. And they would generally come around, which was really great. But I didn't have a real good understanding of that whole thing until I was really an adult. Anyhow, during the summer of 1960, this group, NAG, came to Glen Echo Amusement Park. The Bannockburn residents would prove a willing ally during that summer of change. After the park's closure on September 11th, 1960, the protesters dispersed and vowed to return. Civil disobedience then sparked political maneuvering. Bannockburn resident and newly appointed Attorney General Robert Kennedy on February 1961 was very involved with that. He threatened to have the federal government revoke the lease upon which the trolley from downtown BC to Glen Echo ran. And as I said before, that was a really important part of the whole deal. In addition to the summer protest, such maneuvering led to the March 14, 1961 announced that the park would open its doors to any patron regardless of skin color. Quite an accomplishment, actually. Will Haywood's showdown details the law as the greatest social tool for progress and social development. It was necessary to create relationships to survive in a segregated society. Now, Northerners in general had a moral commitment to inclusion. Sometimes it was more words than action, but yes. In general, though, they didn't have the connections Southerners had with the African American community, even though they were not equal relationships. Southern society has an intimate awareness of interracial connections. The Brown decision was critical, not just in what it said, but in what it represented. Reflecting on the decision and its aftermath, Charlie Duncan posited the chances are I could make an argument that Black kids received a better education before Brown than they did after. Irrespective of the law, residential patterns made de facto segregation widespread, a trend exacerbated by the perceived vagueness of required implementation of the decision with all deliberate speed. Now, that is what they said, when they requested it, all deliberate speed. And in a kind of ironic thing, Dr. Duncan named his yacht All Deliberate Speed. It's kind of an ironic thing. Now, I remember that period of time and in school. And, once again, I was totally blessed and having been at a school where it was said, the reason that these African American students may seem to not be as smart or may not seem to be as good as students is not because of any kind of organic impairment or difference. It has to do with the fact that they haven't been exposed and allowed the information. And, that was a big turning point in many ways.
I think the leaders of your school did some wonderful things in not watering down expectations, but giving people the assistance they needed to get them up to where they needed to be. And on a smaller scale, Dr. Duncan's policy of establishing relationships proved very effective. He even had a connection with, at that time, a segregationist leader and a future hero of the Watergate scandal, Senator Sam Ervin. Senator Ervin cherished the old social structure. I do not think he would have thought of himself as a bigot. He did not have the blanket racism that his Dixiecrat colleagues had. but as Justice Marshall said, a morbid fear that too much change too fast would cause chaos, as Dr. Hayward remarks in his book. It is not that Sam Ervin did not have, as they were called then, Negro acquaintances. He did. They were his family's domestic help. As a country lawyer, he had helped them in any way he could and had loved, quote, chuckling with them on his porch. African American visitors to Ervin's office were welcomed with smiles. Did the senator know their family? Could they use a scholarship to the local segregated college? If anyone mentioned segregation, an aide would smilingly usher them out. As the great Estes Kefauver, a former vice presidential nominee, said, referring to Ervin and some of his compatriots, Sam Ervin was a great man whose mind was confused and poisoned by race.
Indeed. You know, Charlie Duncan, Dr. Duncan, could navigate through all societal groups. He was able to assert himself when necessary. Oh, yes, very strongly. But he could also engage in a playful banter that almost seemed harmless when needed. Thus, he was able to camouflage a true purpose and illuminating purpose. He could find ways to teach with techniques as hidden as a pill in a dog's treat. A conversation designed to be ordinary and relaxed in a way no one could prove otherwise would often contain a significant point couched in humorous terms. I witnessed that on a couple of occasions. This style was demonstrated when he was discussing the conversation or the controversial issue of Washington, D.C. home rule. Now, Walter Washington, the first D.C. elected mayor, asked for Howard University history and legal professors to help diffuse tensions after the riots of 1967. Now remember, this time the country was on fire. The extremists on both sides needed a listening ear. The pressure lasted at least a year. In 1968, many Vietnam War protesters were arrested, along with members of the Panthers, as a result of disturbances in the summer. Now, during this time, Charlie Duncan didn't sleep for 4 nights. He wandered the courthouse streets and the government buildings and whatnot, and around in the city, trying to deter violence. One tale from the American Heroes video may sum up some of that. He said there was a bearded gentleman who had thrown a bottle into a giant grocery store. Now, Giant is the company name for those of you not familiar with stores in that area. The owner had agreed not to press charges if I could talk some sense into the young man. Duncan said, "My man, is a few bottles of Coke and some bread worth the hassle from the fuzz? It'd be a total loss, a total waste to lock this young man up. However, his energy could and should be channeled and used for something worthwhile." And he laughed and said, "That man's a plumber, an Urban League member."
Great example of expecting the best of somebody and giving them encouragement that they're able to do so. I was particularly impressed during looking at his tenure as the dean of Howard Law School, the way Dr. Duncan expected the students to adhere to the rigorous standards, which, as befitting an elite law school, he believed students could and should perform at the very best and tolerated no sloppiness. These expectations generated some disgruntlement among students who had sometimes not been held to those standards in the past because no one had believed they could achieve at that level. Dr. Duncan wanted to challenge students to become their best selves because cutting corners relegated people to a lower standard and they were less well thought of. He cared about the law school and he cared about the students. His efforts elevated the standing of Howard Law School and produced lawyers who served brilliantly in all legal branches. In 1993, Secretary of State Warren Christopher requested Dr. Duncan to serve as a United States delegate on the International Committee trying to recover expropriated United States assets in Iran. The International Court of Justice, the so-called World Court, was trying to find some equitable solution. Dr. Duncan was asked to become involved because of his extensive knowledge of Iranian culture, based on his work in Tehran in the 1970s during the so-called White Revolution period under the last Shah. If you want to find out a little more about that, listen to our Vietnam Peace Plan video or read the book I've written on that subject. Despite his familiarity with the culture and awareness of the problem, other international events sadly caused his efforts to be somewhat unsuccessful.
Yeah, uh, things happen sometimes. Several corporations, including Coca-Cola, General Electric, and the Welch Foundation, were anxious to make use of Duncan's insights and skills as a negotiator and asked him to be on their board of directors. An interesting aside to that, Charlie Duncan, uh, he told me this. He said, these people needed a token black man and they thought they could use me. They didn't know what they were getting into because I used them to be able to forge other relationships and make some other changes. Anyhow, one of those things that happened was the Coke chairman, Robert Woodruff, asked Duncan to help him find work for those unable or unwilling to use the typical employment offices. Woodruff founded the Hardcore Unemployables Committee, a subset of the Job Corps, and asked Duncan to manage the committee. In the first 3 months of existence, the committee found jobs in 36 bottling plants for former prisoners and rehabbed alcoholics and addicts of all sorts. You know, the last time I saw Charlie Duncan, he had come to the Epic Center at Disney World down in Florida to attend an annual board of directors meeting. I think it was for like General Electric. I'm not positive about that. And he invited me to dinner. You know, I hadn't seen him for several years, and I was delighted that he remembered me and had his usual sense of humor. Now, he told me when I said that, he said, well, I invited your secretary, and he said, you know, she was my secretary before she came down to Florida. Now she's your secretary. And she told him she wanted him to meet me. When she told Duncan my name, he recollected having met me. Don't know how. The man had a prodigious memory. It was quite amazing. He met me when I came to see him at Howard University, which is a whole nother story, which we won't get into. He had not told her we'd already met. So he and I decided to have some fun with the situation. It was hilarious. Really, Yeah. Anyhow, after pranking our befuddled secretary for a while, the three of us spent some time reminiscing. I finally got to ask him why he had agreed to meet me as I was a kid when I met him. And he said that he thought it might be an object lesson for me to visit him at Howard. Boy, was he correct.
I've been blessed, at least which by yourself, Dr. Weaver, with knowing many prominent people, and that sense of encouragement and expectation mixed together has made my own experience, such as it is, much better. And I think that sums up Dr. Duncan's life mission in so many areas of life. He played a vital role, elevating a law school to its best, integrating public facilities, or tapping into the hidden fire of a generation of young people. He cultivated intelligence and disarming humor, which served him everywhere from the corridors of the Capitol to an academic office when he was ferreting out the flaws in some freshmen's arguments. He wanted a society based on mutual respect and hard work. His reward was a community more aware of the contributions everyone could give, not through diluting standards, the bigotry of low expectations, but by expecting the best from all around him. To Duncan's death on May 4th, 2004, Washington, D.C. ended a life of largely unsung but no less great achievements. As with so many, his brand of persuasion and adherence to the highest standards will be missed by all who love the best of American democracy.
But yeah, I have been really fortunate to have met many wonderful and some famous people in my life. At the beginning of this podcast, I said I was honored to have met Charlie Duncan. In reality, meeting him and experiencing firsthand some of his accomplishments was pivotal to making me the person I am. Yes, I am honored to have met him, but I'm also extremely grateful. It was pivotal. It made a difference. Listen, we need to close this out for now. We want to make sure that we get this up during Black History Month, and that's very appropriate, I think. And folks, whatever racial heritage you may have, uh, do not view Black History Month as elevating African Americans above where they should be or any of that other crap. Not true. What it is a vital part of our history. And yes, celebrate. And if you know someone, say, hey, glad that this is Black History Month, and we enjoy you being here. And I'm glad you're here. Listen, as we close, I want to thank our listeners for listening. And, the usual, while you're thinking about it, why not just scroll down and click on subscribe, make a comment. We love reading them. It is really important to us. And yes, we do pay attention, and we do alter our methods and what we're doing to some extent in that regard. Not that we're going to take dictation from whomever to do things, but suggestions are always welcome. And yes, I want you to pay particular attention soon. We're going to launch History Twists, which is an alternative history podcast series. It's not going to be your normal, hodgepodge stuff. We're really working on this, and I'm excited about it. I know, Dr. Dean, you're excited about it. You've wanted to do this for a long time.
Indeed, I have.
And we've got some good stuff coming. So click the like, subscribe, give a comment, and most important, join us again. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, folks.
Bye for now.
Bye bye.